Chapter 15. Goodbye, Grandma. There's still something you've left out, Mrs. Cranky said. I can't think what it could be, George said. Give it up, Mrs. Cranky said. Pack it in. You'll never get it right. Mr. Cranky looked very forlorn. George looked pretty fed up, too. He was still kneeling on the ground with a spoon in one hand and the cup full of medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking slowly away. At that point, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the three people below her and shouted, "What's going on around here? Why hasn't anyone brought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough having to sleep in the yard with the rats and mice, but I'll be blowed if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs and bacon, no buttered toast." "I'm sorry, Mother," Mrs. Cranky said. "We've been terribly busy. I'll get you some right away." "Let George get it, the lazy little brute," Grandma shouted. Just then the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw that it was full of brown liquid. It looked very much like tea. "Ho, ho," she cried. "Ha, ha, so that's your little game, is it? You look after yourself all right, don't you? You make quite sure that you've got a nice cup of morning tea, but you didn't think to bring one to your poor old grandma. I always knew you were a selfish pig." "No, Grandma," George said. "This isn't—" "Don't lie to me, boy," the enormous old hag shouted. "Pass it up here this minute." "No," cried Mrs. Cranky. "No, Mother, don't. That's not for you." "Now you're against me, too," shouted Grandma. "My own daughter trying to stop me having my breakfast, trying to starve me out." Mr. Cranky looked at the horrid old woman and smiled sweetly. "Of course it's for you, Grandma," he said. "You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot." "Don't think I won't," Grandma said, bending down from her great height and reaching out a huge horny hand for the cup. "Hand it over, George." "No, no, Grandma," George cried out, pulling the cup away. "You mustn't. You're not to have it." "Give it to me, boy," yelled Grandma. "Don't," cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's George's marvelous—" "Everything's George's around here," shouted Grandma. "George is this, George is that. I'm fed up with it." She snatched the cup out of George's little hand and carried it high up out of reach. "Drink it up, Grandma," Mr. Cranky said, grinning hugely. "Lovely tea." "No," the other two cried. "No, no, no." But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp she swallowed everything that was in it. "Mother," wailed Mrs. Cranky, "you've just drunk 50 doses of George's marvelous medicine number 4, and look what one tiny spoonful did to that little brown hen." But Grandma didn't even hear her. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth and was beginning to whistle. "This is going to be interesting," Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. "Now you've done it," cried Mrs. Cranky, glaring at her husband. "You've cooked the old girl's goose." "I didn't do anything," Mr. Cranky said. "Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it." A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth and nose and ears and whistling as it came. "She'll feel better after she's let off a bit of steam," Mr. Cranky said. "She's going to blow up," Mrs. Cranky wailed. "Her boiler's going to burst." "Stand clear," Mr. Cranky said. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old hag's head, and the whistling was so high and shrill it hurt the ears. "Call the fire department," called Mrs. Cranky. "Call the police. Man the hoses." "Too late," said Mr. Cranky, looking pleased. "Grandma," shrieked Mrs. Cranky. "Mother, run to the drinking trough and put your head under the water." But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She had started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down fast. "Watch this, George," Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard and flapping his arms. "Watch what happened when someone's had 50 spoonfuls instead of 1. Very soon, Grandma was back to normal height. "Stop, Mrs. Cranky," cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's just right." But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got. Down and down she went. In another half-minute, she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. "How do you feel, Mother?" asked Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul and furious expression it always had. Her eyes, no bigger than little keyholes, were blazing with anger.
"How do I feel?" she yelled. "How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you'd been a glorious giant a minute ago and suddenly you're a miserable midget?"
"She's still going," shouted Mr. Cranky gleefully. "She's still getting smaller." And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a cigarette, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and cried, "How do I stop her getting smaller still?" "You can't," said Mrs. Cranky. "She's had 50 times the right amount." "I must stop her," Mrs. Cranky wailed. "I can hardly see her as it is." "Catch a hold of each end and pull," Mr. Cranky said. But then Grandma was the size of a matchstick and still shrinking fast. A moment later, she was no bigger than a pin, then a pumpkin seed, then... "Where is she?" cried Mrs. Cranky. "I've lost her." "Hooray!" said Mr. Cranky. "She's gone. She's disappeared completely," cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's what happens to you if you're grumpy and bad-tempered," said Mr. Cranky. "Great medicine of yours, George." George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes, Mrs. Cranky kept wandering around with a puzzled look on her face, saying, "Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you got to? How can I find you?" But she calmed down quite quickly, and by lunchtime she was saying, "Oh, well, I suppose it's all for the best, really." She was a bit of a nuisance around the house, wasn't she? "Yes," Mr. Cranky said, "she most certainly was." George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning. For a few brief moments, he had touched with the very tips of his fingers the edge of a magic world. And that, my friends, is the end of our story.